All right, welcome everybody back with more Muster. I think this is where we left off. It's been a minute. I can go to let me pop it in there full frame. Dave is here. Hey, Dave said that they ordered this after the first video and still hasn't shown up. Well, patience, patience. I'm sure it'll be there eminently. Well, I can't be sure of anything, but I think it'll get there eventually. In any case, you've got the stream to keep you company until your physical version arrives. So I'm going to start here at casualty rules as my chair is creeping down on me. Let me just fix that now. Oh, please don't be one of those days where my chair is going to keep descending. Okay. I got my mint green tea spindrift for the working man. We are at casualty rules. Older D&D rules. Oh, and this is Muster, by the way, in case you missed the title and everything else. I didn't really do a good job of introing it. We're on part 4. So if you're wondering what the heck Muster is, I recommend going back and starting with part 1 and working your way up to now. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So check out part 1, or there's a link to Muster. It's free. Download it on a TTRPG. You can also order print versions. So there's really no reason not to pick it up in some form and give it at least a flip through. All right. Starting over. Casualty rules. Older D&D rules tend to describe characters falling to 0 hit points as quote-unquote dead. This is, to my best understanding, an early preferred simplification that still stands on its merits for any scenario where you simply don't want to bother with injuries, triage, treatment of crippled veterans, and so on. All legit topics for sure, but not for all games. Later on, the rules have generally gotten more realistic in this regard, perhaps driven by an unhygienic desire to provide quote-unquote fudge space for a referee desiring to decide that a beloved character is only nearly dead, so to speak. Or equally possibly, you might desire to discover that simulation space between being struck down as a casualty of combat and perhaps recovering from it later. In the real world, there is a wide, tragic window of possibility between being uninjured and being dead. Yeah, and there was, I forget what it was something on what was it, the Battle of Cannae, right, which was between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And it's famous encirclement tactic. You had a much larger Roman army that somehow the Carthaginians, this is Hannibal. Hey, Ian, Hannibal, kind of at the peak of his powers, manages to encircle. And the interesting thing, I guess, about it, which brings it to mind, is that at a certain point, the fight was basically over, but they still had to go and actually kill everybody. And just how much work there was in sort of a brutal way of having to go and put down all these Romans, and this is where I don't know if it popularized, but this idea of burying your head in the sand, because literally some of the roads, because you had these big units, right? So had this massive soldiers, and you're working, assuming you're on the Carthaginian side at this point, you're working your way. Oops, let me move this over inward like this, and so you had soldiers who are inside there who are just waiting to die, basically, and some of them literally suffocated themselves by burying their heads in the ground. Lovely stuff, but this idea of the dying state, right? In any kind of battlefield, I guess, because you don't have to be quite go to the extremes. It's that one. You have this, stories told of folks coming by and finishing off all the folks who are in that dying state. I happen to like a dying state. Daniel in his game has something he calls defeated, which I quite like, which is basically when you're knocked out, you're sort of defeated, meaning that you're down for the count, but kind of depending on the type of opponent and sort of what's going on, you may, at that point, it's basically you have a choice, or you're at the choice of the victors as to whether, or I presume the opponent in the moment, as to whether you're actually killed or not. Animals would tend to kill you. Other opponents may tend to leave you in that sort of downed state and then maybe decide what to do later, or bandage you up and essentially, cart you off as prisoners, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see what else Muster has to say on it. Okay. I generally recommend using some kind of casualty rules for 2 reasons. The baseline simulation is more realistic if the game actually does measure the idea of injury. I think it makes for interesting gameplay concerns. The core conceit of 0 hit points equals death is too easy on the survivors when they should be struggling with the awful choices that triage and survival would reasonably force on the adventurers. For a simple rules add to an otherwise baseline system, consider this. After a character falls in combat, they get a saving throw to still be alive after the fight. Quick first aid can advantage the roll. Such an injured character would recover to adventure again, but only if they can be brought home despite the injury here and now. So let me read that again. Quick first aid can advantage the roll. So you're going to get a saving throw. You can just add advantage. So you can roll 2 dice, take the better one if you're able to get first aid. And then recovery is slow. So which is recovery slow in the old game anyway. So that's probably kind of as is, though I presume you could add some kind of injured, which could maybe even disadvantage you further. I think the one thing with all these systems, and I'm not necessarily against things like I see a lot of people like kind of lingering injuries and wounds and, oh, now you got this and that, is I think you just want to be, it's obviously going to depend on the style of game that you're playing, but I think you just want to be careful that you're not making it a chore for this character to survive. Because at a certain point, especially at low levels, when, right, we know the OSR characters tend to be fairly disposable. If you then make it a pain, oh, you've got a broken leg, oh, your movement speed reduced by half, oh, you're at -4 to do this, you're -8 to that, then if you're only first level or maybe even second level, I'm not sure what level the calculus changes. It's probably going to, again, depend on the table, player, and campaign, but you're most likely to go, you know what, just leave that guy to die. I'll just make a new guy. Make somebody new just because they're fresh. And we don't want to slow down the game or whatever because this guy's got to go rest in the hospital for a month before he's back. Now, you may like that. Your game may be more time flowing, and that all makes sense. And you're playing with a roster of characters. And so, yeah, that guy's going to have action for 6 months, but that's okay because you got another folks are coming and filling the gaps. If that's your game, then that'll work great. But for other folks where they're more or less playing one person, if you just stack the deck too much against them in the goal of, simulation or realism, then there's just kind of no reason to live. And I tend to personally fall back on the kind of sword and sorcery trope in which Conan and those of like types don't tend to really have much injuries. They, lesser of them, the ones that don't make it, can die or whatnot. But Conan, either you've killed him or somehow he's going to crawl out of a bunch of dead bodies. And yeah, he's going to be all cut and bloody and everything, but he's essentially going to be Conan. And that's how I tend to do it. But I could see working it differently, but you just want to keep that balance in mind. However that balance is for you, just know that, you're tilting it a lot one way. You might get people who are just like, I don't want this guy. Why do I want a guy he's going to be basically out of action, or he's just going to be have so many things piled up against him. I'd rather just start off new again. Hey, Proudfoot. The Dave says wounds can be fun, but they have to be playable. Yeah, playable, or you just have to have, like I said, it's got to be factored in, right? If you want to make a guy out for a month because they're in a field hospital or they're at the inn convalescing, then your game just has to support that. Because what's that player doing? Is that fun? And it could be. And I'm only thinking if there's one character this happens to, that already could be a damper. What if you have 2 or 3 that end up in this state over a battle or two? Then what is the party? Maybe you want that. Oh, I want the party to be convalescing in an inn for 6 months and we'll do this forward and all this stuff. And that's great. But if you don't, then just, think about it, because the party's probably not going to want to adventure much longer if a bunch, more than a bit of the party is messed up. Maybe even if one character is kind of on the mend or is hurt in a sustained way, they're going to want to go retreat and heal up. And if that works for you, great. But if not, just keep it in mind. MM says that Muster assumes the use of character stables. Yeah, I would say so. We covered that earlier on, but yes, they certainly favor it. But it's a good thing to know, because oftentimes we can see these things. Someone might catch this part of the stream and not catch the earlier parts of the stream. Yeah, if you're using stables, especially in stables in kind of I don't even call it West Marches, because it way predates West Marches, but the idea of everybody basically is retiring to a set location, so that's easy to swap out those characters, which I guess is now we would call it West Marches style, where you have some kind of home, some kind of a base, town, settlement, and that way you can you get back to the keep, and then guy who's hurt can go in the hospital, or the barber, or just hang out at the inn, and then a new guy can come in. Oftentimes people play games a little bit differently now, right? So you just gotta, if you are playing outside that assumption that Ben talks about, the assumption that Muster rolls with, then you definitely want to keep that in mind. In summary, characters don't necessarily die at 0 HP. They just become combat casualties, whatever that means in your campaign. But I do like that. I do agree with them totally on the kind of dying thing. And that's what I did with Poison, is I want to do that same thing. I wanted Poison to give them a thing of, what do we do? As opposed to, oh, they're dead, so just kick their bodies to the side and keep going. Skill rules. Older D&D doesn't really have skill rules in the way that's become standard for traditional role-playing games over the years. I would advise considering the reasons carefully and trying out the game without such. One of the big reasons for not having skill rules is that wargaming D&D simulation logic often de-emphasizes character skill and task resolution in a big way compared to modern RPG design. For a game coming from the wargaming culture, it made sense to think of tasks foremost in terms of resources, manpower, time, money, etc., and inherent risk of complication. The idea of having a big pants expert as part of the adventuring party, somebody who's carefully simulated skill rating, would be an overwhelming determinant of whether the task succeeds or not, wasn't as obvious as it is in modern role playing. Unless the campaign has some particular reason to care, I would suggest giving the old style of task resolution a try. It's often more realistic, and it's easier to add rules when and if you need them. In summary, try the game without skill rules. You might like it. I think the big thing in here is that it's well, I don't know. The white box, I'd have to go back and even look to see whether they even suggest what to do when you want to roll chance in those cases. This is something where I'm not going to say I disagree with them, because I agree. And when I've talked about the kind of skill kind of things that I want to do, it falls very much in line with trying to keep it to the stuff to a couple different things, where not trying to use it for everything and not trying to have it be an overwhelming decider. But I think, unfortunately, the old games don't do a good job of giving you a sort of an easy resolution system. BX, I know, does have, I think, in the back of one of the books, might be expert, might be basic, I'm not sure, basically saying, hey, here are a couple of ways you can do to decide things. Because all that stuff's great, but when it comes down to it, like, gee, we need to decide whether they can climb up this cliff or not, and we're pre-thief, or we don't have any thieves, and so we don't have any concept of a climbing skill or what that could mean. Especially if you're new, you're looking at it going, okay, I want to climb. Now you could just do, hey, one way that BX uses, or BX suggests, it's kind of I think it's the last way, not last in terms of they don't recommend it, but the one they kind of go in order of, you can use X and 6, you can roll under attributes, or you can roll percentage. Basically, you could do a D100 roll. Hey, I think you got a 10% chance of climbing that cliff, so roll and beat 90 or roll under 10, however you want to factor it in, go. Of course, you could do X and 6, or you could roll under strength. But unfortunately, the game just doesn't do a good job of just outlining for a new GM, how do you handle those things? What do you do? Now, you can figure it out. You can read between the lines. You can do whatever. And then eventually, I think the game kind of filled it in. I think so I guess what I'd say is I think there's kind of a sweet spot. And the thing is, I keep saying new GMs here, because if you have some experience, you're going to go, well, of course, I'm just going to do this. Well, I'll just do X and 6. Oh, 1 in 6 chance of climbing the cliff. Easy peasy. And it's easy for experienced GMs who've done this a bunch of times to do. It's easy for someone who has a lot of experience to say, oh, yeah, we're just going to do, roll under strength. And I'm going to add this modifier, that modifier. Maybe I'll throw an advantage, disadvantage, because it's great, that kind of thing. But when you're new, and I don't, and I always try to think about not only experienced GMs, but new folk who might be catch onto this stream for whatever reason, new folk who might pick up muster because they're curious, whatever. New folk, it's harder, it's more difficult. And I kind of wish that they had thought about that in terms of, let's give you some of the basics. And eventually they got to it in BX, they did do that. But I think if you're looking at the white box, I had to go back and see, I don't think it really gives you a, hey, do this. It could be as easy as just flip a coin. Just anything to just give somebody who's not an experienced wargamer or RPGer at this point. And remember, right now, when you go back and I think it's easy to read the white box, and it seems, I guess I would say this, I love the white box. I love 0E or the 3 brown books. But I came to them having under my belt, I don't know, what do you want to say, 20, 30 years of RPG and D&D experience. So anything that is lacking, I will tend to just backfill from my head, right? I will read it, and if there's something missing, I'm probably going to miss it myself. I'm probably going to assume it's there, or I'm going to assume it's somewhere else, or I'm just going to make an assumption because I have 20 to 30 years. I don't even know. I haven't calculated. Probably, actually, it's more than that now. I don't want to. I'm not going to say because I don't want to age myself. 40 years of experience of D&D, so it's very easy for me to pick up and say, "Oh yeah, we're just going to roll the die. Oh yeah, we're going to do that." And it's not just, and it isn't just thinking about it like, "Oh, we're going to do this." There's a confidence part of it. I'm confident enough. I'm going to PAX Unplugged later this week. If I happen to run a game and I needed to do something, I'd be confident everything. Just go, yeah, just flip a coin. This is a sheer cliff. It's made of glass that's been greased down, and also, yeah, just roll, flip a coin. Flip 2 coins, right? Whatever. Figure it out. We'll go with it, easy to do. But for an inexperienced GM, that could be a nerve-wracking. You're looking around the table. You don't want to be wrong. You don't want to do whatever Chaos Juncture says, like them as a new GM. And so while I appreciate the advice saying, hey, try it, that kind of glosses over the fact that you're going to, at some point in your game, you're going to come to a point where you're going to need to roll for something. You're going to need to decide something. You're going to want to use a dice that isn't in those old school books. Just not there. At least until you get to BX, where they give you some blanket. And I think it's in BX, but I could be backfilling that myself. I don't have the books in front of me, unfortunately, to flip through and check. But you're going to get to that point where someone's going to ask you if they can do something, and it's not going to be a question of manpower, time, or money. It's not, we could throw 10 guys at the problem, because you might not have 10 guys. You might be in the middle of a dungeon. You're in the dungeon, so you don't have oodles of time, and money doesn't matter. I want to get up to that thing. Can I climb it? And you can either go yes, you can go no, or you could say chance decides. And when it comes to chance deciding, I think that's where I would say, I mean, I think for a new GM, just saying like, yeah, use X and 6 if it's easy. And I mean, if it's easy, probably don't roll. If it's moderately difficult, roll if you get above a 3. If it's hard, roll above a 5 or 6. And if it's really hard, 6, right? That's kind of where I would come out if I was just going to give somebody 1. But, I think give someone something, because they will need it. And they don't have the background to just pull something out of their butt or borrow something from another system and say, oh, yeah, in 3rd edition, we did this, so I'll just do this again. Or in BX, I read about this. They might not have that in the back of their brain. Sorry for the roundabout. Dave says, this is why every one of those games are homebrew. Yeah, because you're going to have to add in some things. Yeah, they're frameworks that you flesh out to suit your table. All right, campaign structure. When you begin a new D&D campaign, it is either in basic or extended format. These are just words I like to use for the strategic scope of the project. Both types are very established. Both types are fun games. But I recommend the basic structure to new referees, as it is a simpler, quicker game. You can transition the campaign to the extended model later if you would. How the basic game plays. In the basic campaign, the strategic context of play is fixed by convention. The game is specifically about this adventuring party delving into this dungeon in hopes of finding great treasures, or more specifically, some MacGuffin or other defined at scenario start. The game begins at the dungeon door, as is often said. The subject matter of play is dungeon warfare, doctrine and conduct of dungeon exploration. This is the game taught by the highly influential basic D&D line of game text. It's manageable for newcomers because both the referee and the adventurers have a fairly stable and clear job. To get to play, the referee only needs to prepare to conduct a single dungeon, while the players put together a party by generating characters for all players and putting those together into a party. Right? So they keep on the Borderlands model. Basically, you're there with a specific goal, which is the Caves of Chaos, or I don't know. Does they call it the Caves of Chaos in the Keep or whatever it is? Root out the source of evil that happens to be the case. I discussed the general outline of how basic D&D plays at the beginning of the book, like so. In summary, 1, generate characters and set up the party, equipment, hirelings, scenario rooms, etc. GM introduces the scenario. Gameplay typically begins at the dungeon entrance. Then you play the expedition, players maneuver, ref resolves, and then you return from the dungeon and score the success. This expedition cycle is a complete war game in itself. The dungeons prepared by the referee test adventurers in various ways, asking them for risk management, knowledge of folklore and myth, small unit military tactics in dark places, and more. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it probably matches, Into the Unknown, which I think basically has you starting the dungeon. Keep, in that sense, is actually a little bit of a expansion on that, because I think, right, Into the Unknown, whatever the first one is, Into the Unknown? In Search of the Unknown? That is literally the dungeon, and you start at the door. And it's specifically a learning dungeon, both for players and for referees. It's the one that has blanks and areas where you as the referee are supposed to it's got some guidance for how to do things like populate rooms, and it actually has space for you to populate some of the rooms in the dungeon yourself. Let's see. The player goal is to above all survive, and secondarily to bring out success from the dreadful depths in the form of treasures to make a venture capitalist blush. Over several sessions, the basic campaign will repeat the pattern. The referee may bring the same dungeon for a new session of play, or if that dungeon has been exhausted, then a new one. Players may make changes to their party composition as their understanding of dungeoneering advances. Fictional particulars about the adventures, their base town, and the surrounding world surrounding world no doubt develop, but the game itself is simple and self-contained, constrained. Each expedition, a dungeon, a new variation of tactical exploration to tackle. And of course, the mega dungeon is basically that, but the dungeon just keeps expanding. So instead of having to find a new dungeon, you find the stairs or whatever you find in some way the next level of that dungeon. And that way you never have to leave that area, right? You could have the keep, you could have the Caves of Chaos, but instead of it being completed, you would continually be finding multiple levels of the caves. Would be the kind of Blackmoor / Castle Greyhawk kind of model. This game has been played a lot, and generally speaking, it's a hoot. The referee must be unbiased, and that's easier if you run the adventures through dungeons that are not of your own creation. It makes the scenario more arbitrary and therefore easier to keep fair than if the referee designs their own dungeons. However, basic D&D is also fairly narrow. The premise of Dungeon Assault has a lot of variety, but it does run out with time. D&D's story did not end with that. Onto Extended Vision of a Living World. Extended D&D, sometimes called Expert, Advanced, or Sandbox, is what basic D&D adapted into, and tends to adapt today when played for a while. It is fairly natural for both the referee and the players to start asking questions about what lies outside that dungeon, after all. Experienced groups and referees often brew a new campaign in the extended format from the start, sort of starting from where their earlier efforts in learning the game have left off. Characteristic of extended D&D is that it has a strategic layer lacking in the basic D&D. The adventurers still enter dungeons on treasure hunts, yes, but they also have lives between adventures. They plan expeditions, travel to faraway places, visit royal courts, sail on ships, and generally live the exciting lives of high-rolling adventurers, with all the challenges and strategic concerns that involves. Many conceits involved in the basic game grow less binary and more complicated. Adventurers might spend several sessions in a single adventure location. Players might have many characters they manage in a character stable. Characters may have complicated motivations and interests beyond growing rich by seeking forgotten treasures. The group maintains a calendar of fictional events, tracing the maneuvers of their adventures in both space and time. Perhaps the single most important aspect of extended D&D, whence it gains the appellation of sandbox, it is no longer the referee who chooses the next adventure. The referee prepares a variety of ideas, and the play group suggests more, adventures often arising from the personal interests of the players and characters. Such adventures are usually placed on a map so the adventurers can choose where to travel to encounter a variety of risks and opportunities. The very direction of the campaign is in the hands of the players, who can choose both what is wise for their characters and what is interesting to the players. The victory condition of extended D&D remains unchanged in the sense that you are still attempting to avoid death and gain points. The long-term prospects in both senses can develop far more complex, of course, and the terrain over which scenarios stretch has the potential to be wildly varied because of how complicated the substantial matter of D&D has become. I like to phrase the wargaming topic of general D&D in a very specific way, reflecting the scope and variety of the game. How will you succeed and prosper in this cruel and beautiful world? It is a phrasing that lights my guts aflame. How indeed. I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah, that really is it, right? How will you survive is the question. And then it's up to the characters or the players to really figure out how their characters could try to answer that. And succeeding in prosperity in old school D&D tends to be about the same thing because you're getting money, which is both how you level up that kind of success, and it also, of course, is your prosperity. A campaign matures in tiers. Campaigns in the basic or extended mold can both be started from scratch at first level, and they look fairly similar to start with. The biggest difference tends to be that an extended campaign usually involves a map of the wider game setting and several possible adventuring opportunities the players can choose from. I will discuss the particulars of how to set that up later on. For a basic game, preparing a single dungeon suffices. Basic type D&D campaigns are naturally limited to the subject matter vis-a-vis the simulation model of D&D. Dungeon adventuring is a low-level game. It is common for campaigns to expand beyond those limits as players experience campaign history, and character power grow beyond simple dungeoneering. D&D development made what to me seems like a grave doctrinal error fairly early by attempting to artificially extend dungeon play across a great level range, positing adventures of high, even double-digit levels, engaging in the looting missions and dungeons that developed little in scope from what they were at low levels. I mention this because it is not difficult to find rules texts that encourage extending the basic campaign in this way with more of the same. The alternate perspective, also well attested in the game's textual history, posits that a D&D campaign will naturally evolve through a series of tiers or modes of play that involve qualitative changes in the subject matter of the game as a natural consequence of the fantasy adventure simulation model. As player characters grow into greater heroes fit for more romantic types of adventures, as players' experience grows and interest shifts, as campaign settings develop intricate detail, new forms of the game reveal themselves to us. So basically, at least their idea is that just trying to make dungeoneering the thing for all the levels of D&D, it's gonna lose its luster. Um, I don't know if that's true or not, but my games tend to be more varied so that I'm not just doing. I think even at low levels, my parties don't tend to just do dungeons, or at least maybe the players that I've had are have varied interests in things, so they haven't been fixated on a dungeon, so that hasn't necessarily been an issue. And I'm playing in Daniel's OD&D game, and we still do a fair amount of dungeoneering, but it's in the context of events happening. We're not dungeoneering just for profit, though we might. I mean, we have some leads on some profit, but we tend to be trying to solve problems, and the solutions end up being in a dungeon. So down we go. But I think that the important distinction is that it has to, like in this case, right, our aims are different. Our high level when we go into a dungeon is different from our aims at low level. So even if you're going to if you want to keep dungeons as a concern at higher levels, the context has to change, or it's going to change for the players and the characters, and it ought to change for you as the referee. Whether it does or not, I think is going to probably say whether having that dungeoneering kind of falls flat. I would say for sure that it probably dungeoneering should probably fade away as the main thing you're doing earlier, and not or should not extend. It should not be the main thing you're doing late in game. Maybe I should say that, or late in your career. But you can still mix it in, I think. There are philosophies on this, but I take a constructionist view myself. Our mission as players of the game is to take its base modeling tools and apply them to discover what these further tiers of the game are like. It is as objective a course of discovery as charting the opening theory of chess has been for that game. As much of a noble human pursuit in indulgently throwing our intellect against the cosmos. That being said, let me introduce what we know of the tiering theory of D&D at this time. Just a quick look at the possibilities. I think that being aware of this big picture helps a lot in planning your own sojourns with the game. And this kind of idea of tiering things is it's still applying. People think of modern D&D or fifth edition as having kind of tiers from 1 to whatever till 20. Being your, I don't know if they just call them high level, mid level, whatever. So it's not just something that we do with OSR D&D, but let's see what they have to say about it. I just need to get a little refill of tea. Low tier. Low-level play on basic tier or fantasy Vietnam, quote-unquote, or dungeoneering tier. And this is levels 1 to 3, up to about 10,000 experience points. Low-level play is the initial picture of the game as you begin a new campaign, basic or extended in structure. The rules for low-level characters are very lethal, realistic, and traditionally wargame-like. The scenarios are near exclusively about dungeoneering, loose adventurers risking their lives to search for treasures in dangerous, mysterious, hidden corners of the world. This is... I'm just going to skip over the graphic for a minute. This is the basic D&D. The narrow dungeon-focused campaign never needs to leave this mode of activity as successful adventurers retire into a comfortable victory. Basic campaigns are constrained to the basic tier, and to my knowledge, never essentially leave it. I would personally advise retiring characters at 10,000 experience points at the latest, setting them off to enjoy their veritable victory over their chosen career, levels 1 to 3 as it is commonly estimated. Extended campaigns, on the other hand, organically leave the basic tier behind as character positioning. The unique situation of the individual adventurer in the game fiction grows more complex. Seems to happen in a natural campaign environment somewhere around 5,000 experience points, but I've seen expert tier play with first level characters as well as characters who show no signs of stepping up, so it's fairly flexible. Although it is not common practice yet, there is a lot of unexplored potential in the staging of low tier scenarios and entire campaigns about concerns beyond dungeoneering. Crime, gentleman thievery, gang life, detective work, war, scouting, special forces work, and even politics or love are very feasible topics for mundane, realistic adventurers to tackle. And that's kind of what my party has done. I'm not going to say I'm the first because I'm sure it's not. Maybe he's talking about the first of, because I don't think it's unexplored, maybe unexplored in products. So I think I would say, what's the, the domain. Why am I spacing out the name of the domain box from second edition? Something something like that, where you kind of starting domain concerns from scratch, from level 1 instead of waiting for high levels. And I don't Birthright, I think, now that my brain's starting to work again, Birthright has some of that at least. But I think a lot of games tend to do that, especially now with the kind of broader OSR, kind of NSR games, where people are moving away from simply looking at it as the dungeons kind of thing. In my experience, it takes about 50 sessions of skill play, maybe 250 hours in total, for a campaign to mature to the point of leaving the low levels decisively behind. Of course, in practical play, we dip back down on occasion as fortunes and player interests dictate. It is not forbidden to enjoy scenarios on lower tiers just because you've achieved higher. And the Dave, yes, Birthright. Okay, so now that we've read that, let's go back to this graphic here for a second. So here's the tiering theory, just their current understanding of traditional D&D tiering. We have low tier, bet about. I like how they did in experience points, because that's kind of important. Because remember, with XP tables, one character's third level is going to look like someone else's second level, which might look at someone else's fifth level. So the experience points kind of evens that out a bit. So from 0 to 10,000 experience points is low tier. Then we get to mid tier, and in mid tier, you're established, or the characters are established Pulp Fiction heroes that travel the world and meddle in the affairs of their betters, brave incredible odds, and survive. And then we get kind of a break here, right? So there you have basically two paths you can go on. But I'll skip the Zeppelin reference this time. So you can go to high tier, which takes you on epic adventures in myth and fairy tale by archetypal or feverishly superhero characters. Or you can split off into the domain game, which you get kind of a Game of Thrones style game about intrigue and war waged by the romantic, quote unquote, important people of the great man theory of history. And then from the domain game, you can take that sidetrack into the domain game and then end up in the high tier after that. And then you've got your divine ascension, where you get to crush gods and replace them. Okay, I think that's a pretty good thing. And I think I don't know when the first, I guess as soon as they came out with the, what was it, gods, heroes, and whatever, people were kind of trying to go off and kill gods. So I guess that kind of immortal tier has been there, but I don't know. I've always just not been. I mean, I think as a kid, the idea of becoming a god was cool, but I don't know. I feel like the Dragonlance Raceland thing, I don't know. It's too. I guess I'm burnt out. I'm burnt out on that particular thing. I'll be happy if I can get there and kind of have fun with domain play and not worry about killing any gods. But that's me. So now we're on the middle tier. So it's mid-level or expert tier. So this is we're middle tier, levels 3 to 7, up to about 100,000 experience points. Mid-level or experienced tier or adventuring tier or wuxia tier is what the extended model campaign slowly turns into as players develop the campaign and characters further. At this point, the player characters are noticeably more competent and powerful than ordinary people they're surrounded by, in a way reminiscent of romantic adventure stories. I often compare the feel to Dumas's Three Musketeers, or pulp heroes like Conan or Flash Gordon, or Chinese wuxia stories. Many changes occurred to the play space, including things like complex character positioning, including determining your own adventuring goals instead of generic treasure hunting. Magical weapons like Fireball routinely defeat low-level dungeon combat doctrines. Adventurers undertaking long expeditions overland or overseas into hard-to-reach places in search of important quest goals. Numerically, mid-levels tend to emerge around 5,000 experience points and continue up to 50,000 or even 100,000 experience points, perhaps up to level 8 or so. Many gamers have historically found this tier of play their favorite in D&D, and it does represent a certain sweet spot for players desirous of a game akin to adventure fiction. We enjoy it tremendously when we get there, but it has tended to be short bursts for us, not sustained flight, as failures strike down would-be heroes and force us to start again. With growing skill, maintaining stable mid-levels play grows ever easier. Again, there's no inherent reason for a campaign to ever advance beyond this stage. I would personally advise that actually starting a campaign at expert tier is difficult and prone to creative failures due to how difficult it is to fake authentic positioning out of the gate. But it's a surmountable challenge for, experts in the game. I believe that once you have passed through the low-level gauntlet a couple of times and pushed a living campaign to the mid-levels, such a group might also entertain the idea of starting there from scratch. Dave says that they don't like running games that are above domain personally. Yeah, I think that's kind of getting away from things. I think it can be fun. I don't know, one shot, an epilogue or something like that, but I don't know that I want to be there all the time. Though I'm all for giving players a choice in terms of whether they want to kind of domain or kind of stick around and do stuff. But like what I like about in BX is right, you get to that certain level, and yeah, you can still incrementally gain stuff, but you're no longer gaining new abilities. So there's nothing really pushing you to keep going up. Yeah, you'll be incrementally better at 18, at 15th level than you will be at someone who's 12th level, but it's not super tough. I mean, of course, in other games, depending on how, like in OD&D, if you're using kind of hit dice and doing that stuff, then continuing to gain levels, let's say as a fighter and racking up increased hit dice can be massive. But you're a one-man army as opposed to somebody else who maybe went the domain route and they literally have an army. So you can pick your poison. But in terms of just kind of escalating it into sort of superheroes and kind of fantasy Avengers, yeah, it's not my bag for the most part. Name level. Oh, and this is levels approximately level 8 up to 1 million experience points. Name level or companion tier or domain game. It's a traditional vision of what a D&D campaign matures into. Established in the early days of the game when it was steeped in wargaming culture. This was the doctrinal position that Gary Gygax took in his game texts on the matter. The idea is that high-level player characters, through great adventures that bring great fame, wealth, and influence, transition into being political leaders of communities, even entire polities, leaving their adventuring days behind and managing political factions in an intense Game of Thrones that combines social, economic, diplomatic, and warfare dimensions in a way that kind of slides D&D into being more of a traditional war game concerned with the conduct of military campaigns and grand strategy. The higher tiers of D&D grow increasingly ephemeral and varied in practical implementation, with important branches of the game's development not necessarily even recognizing the idea of name level. I've benchmarked name level to approximately begin sometime after 100,000 experience points, continuing feasibly up to the 1 million experience points mark, corresponding to a few character levels around 8 or so. As far as I'm concerned, this is still an open frontier of exploration for the game, with much room for establishing further conventions and content. Play culture simply hasn't paid it much attention yet. I think that name level is true in the sense of being a possible and natural transition from mid-levels adventuring, just haven't witnessed it myself yet. It's challenging to just quote-unquote start a campaign at mid-levels. For this tier, I would consider it outright impossible, as for me, it is but a vague mirage still. Yeah, I think this is the harder one to sustain, right? Because if not everybody's on board with the domain, how do you do it? Do you? And this is kind of the thing with Birthright, and I don't know that they came up with the best solution, though I haven't really gamed it out. So about having what if you have some characters that want to get into domains and some characters who don't. Some characters want to keep going in to dangerous places, and some people that want to retire. Now, of course, they can just make new characters, but it's it changes the not that it hurts, but usually if somebody dies and you want to bring somebody along, then you're kind of on this quest to bring them along. That's kind of your goal as a player. I want to get them along. So you might do things that you might not necessarily want to. Like we wanted to go fight this army of dragons. Oh, but we'll take this guy through some adventures, do some things first to kind of get them up. So they're not just going to get into combat with the first dragon, and the first dragon breath just wipes them out, right? Oh, we're going to help them out. It's a little bit different when they're choosing to pull their character out. And now it's like, well, do I want to babysit this guy's first level character? Or, hey man, like you chose to domain yourself. I'm choosing to do this. Why do I have to be subordinate to your domain stuff? And of course, on the flip side, if you're doing something, you have a domain kind of level event coming up, do you invite everybody to play, or do you just invite the domain folks? Or how do you do it? And what are those folks doing when there's domain stuff happening that has to, you can do some of it over email or text or whatever, but sometimes you also want to do it, on your game night. Kind of how does that work? So I would agree there hasn't been necessarily the best thing of like, especially if everybody's on board going one way or the other, it does make it a lot simpler. You can hand out your domains or have them cut up one domain amongst themselves, or all have shares and co-op domain, I guess. But since it's very much kind of a player choice thing, and I don't necessarily think I'd want to just force players to take the domain route if they didn't want to, then it's kind of like, well, what do we do? And sometimes when you reach high levels, you kind of want to keep adventuring, at least for some time, because it's just fun. And I guess that's part of what he's saying about this, there being sort of a zone where the transition takes place. Because, I just got my guy to name level. I don't want to retire just yet. I want to go, and I got all this new stuff and I feel super powerful. So I want to go like take it on the road. And you hope that eventually then winds into that space. Maybe there'll become and I know there's tons of rule sets and people mention all kinds of ones, but I don't know if there's been one that everyone just points to and says, yeah, that's the bomb, or that really kind of does it in a way that works for everybody. I don't know. Maybe someone will come up with that still. I know some people love Adventure Conqueror King. I haven't read it, especially not the new edition. I'm not really. It's not really for me at this point. So, and there are other ones, and there's old stuff in the old books, but there probably hasn't been a great unified. Here's how this is going to work. I mean, Birthright, that was kind of what Birthright was trying to do and integrate it from the start, which I think is a good thing to do, is integrate the stuff. Not necessarily in like Birthright what it does, where you have domains kind of from the start, but in terms of having that be on the plate or just kind of on the horizon, or just keeping that in mind as opposed to springing it on you when you get to 8th level, all of a sudden it's like domains. Uh, but there I would agree. There's definitely room there. Dave says, I think that scaling affects this the most. If the power increase is lower, the game works better for this. Yeah, I think. And yeah, right. And then I think the big thing is getting in. I don't know if first edition, I don't really remember if second edition, but certainly third edition on. I mean, even from Beckme, right, where they're pushing like, look, you can be an immortal. It kind of pushes folks towards a certain path. Maybe if they had said, instead of the immortals, they called it, I don't know what, basic, expert, companion. What's M again? Basic, expert, companion. Maybe just had a king. It was just Beck. Then that might have done it. But people like to play gods, right? And like, who's going to say you shouldn't play a god killer that becomes a god? I don't know. I'm not. It's all fun. High tier. This is levels 8 to 12, up to 1 million experience points. Oh, master. This is what the M and Beck means. I've forgotten. High level or master tier or planar tier or Xianxia tier or street level superheroes or epic level is something of alternative to the name level, as a vision of where the game goes after the mid levels, or perhaps a statement on what comes after. Characters at this level of power and romantic stylization are more akin to superheroes or powerful wizards, or perhaps demigods than adventurers. I do not have any true knowledge of what scenarios of this tier should be like, except they apparently involve riding on dragons, shredding electric guitars, and generally just doing whatever the heck you want. Party structure would be naturally abandoned, I expect, in favor of an explicit hero plus entourage model. I don't know if that's true, but I don't have a lot of experience with this level of play, so I can't say. I think the most is I used to read, I forget what forums it's on, and they're still out there. There were some of these campaigns where you'd read their session reports, which were a lot of fun, and some of them were up at the epic tiers, and some of them seem to do really cool things. Like, yeah, you're riding on dragons, you're doing crazy stuff, flying around on wires, just cutting people to shreds, as Jack Burton might say, and it seemed like a lot of fun. I mean, I tip my cap to those GMs who were able to run it and theoretically do it. You're reading an after action report that's by the GM, so no sense of what the games are actually running like. But man, if it's happening kind of like what they say, and it's not taking ages, and it's not all actually flows, then I salute you, sir, or ma'am. Let's see. I strongly suspect that a serious scenario necessarily develops high mechanical complexity by this point, partly because the scenario contents, player characters included, are so fantastic that the game requires heavy formalisms to allow players to quantify issues and operate the resolution processes. How much does a soul weigh anyway? Were you in a position to haul some out of Hades? Were you in the position to haul some out of Hades? And I think this is why a lot of times at those super high levels, they start to, either through calling it a whole new tier or almost giving you a whole other book of rules, is because, look, if you're using X and 6, right, the highest you can get if you're going to have a chance for failure is 5 out of 6, presuming that either 1 or 6 is your auto fail. But then you're getting to like godhood, and that kind of doesn't seem like there's enough granularity there. So now you have to go to something else. Either you bake it in from the start, maybe you do something like D20. Of course, that you can still max that out depending on where you start that out, or you have to suddenly come up with something else, or you probably have to go either way you go. Either if you're using D20 or a D6 or anything, you're probably gonna have to figure out like what happens if I go above 100 if I'm on a D100. Because you're a god now, and now you've maxed stuff out, but now you're fighting other gods. So even though when mortals come along, you're at 100 plus and you just wipe them out without a thought, or maybe with merely a thought, but now you're fighting another god. How does that work? Kind of thing. So I can see that being a case. Divine Ascension. This is levels 12 plus, 1 million experience points and more. This is the Immortals game, Divine tier, or Cosmic Superheroes. It's an occasionally speculated even higher tier of the game, where the player characters rise to positions of literal divine authority over the game world, facing new types of challenges and scenarios unique to a fantastic world of polytheistic gods. The particulars of this state and world are usually imagined as something akin to Olympian myths of ancient Greece, or the stories of Taoist immortals, or cosmic superheroes like the Silver Surfer. which all does seem like it'd be a legit wargaming environment. There are some game texts about this topic, but they are all highly idiosyncratic, in part because it's not that obvious for two D&D developers to agree about the direction the game should take at this point. Even just my suggesting 1 million XP as an appropriate threshold for Divine Ascension is more symbolic numerology than anything else. Well, he's mentioning because it does exist, but we're outside of sort of direct knowledge, and I certainly have no knowledge of that either. So I'm in the same boat. Appreciating the big picture. The scope of D&D's campaign vision is truly immense, as those higher levels of attainment ostensibly require literal thousands of hours of skilled gameplay to actually achieve. Building your scores up carefully in complex strategic patterns, guarding against setbacks, and constructing contingencies in case disaster strikes on the way to the stars. I cannot conceive of it without long years of work in simply achieving technical mastery of the game before attempting a serious push. This is assuming you're doing everything playing properly. I think as time goes on, especially if it's the goal of the table to get to those high levels, I think GMs and probably players alike start to play a little bit fast and loose. So while I agree, if you're playing according to the sort of ethos, the original ethos of you're going to be grinding for years. But look, a lot of people will kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge to kind of get you up there if that's kind of what they want to do. And the Dave says, yes, when the players become the GM. Bow, bow, bow. I have only ever attained mid-levels myself in real play as a player or the dungeon master. Higher tiers of play are so far theoretical to me, for all that I have opinions and hypotheses of how they would function. Were the purpose and rewards of D&D contingent on quote-unquote or reaching the quote-unquote end, it would be a truly futile affair. Fortunately, the campaign arc of leveling is not the true core of the game, and its a reward accrues on much smaller timescales. Still, it is interesting to consider the overall scope of what lies ahead, isn't it? Now, I've played in domain games, but not actually as part of D&D proper. The first kind of domain games I played in was I was actually in high school. I was living overseas, and I played some one-on-one gaming where me and a friend of mine, we would take turns. We had two characters, and we would take turns being the D&D. So sometimes I'd be the D&D, and my character would be a NPC, and his character would be going on adventures. And sometimes he was the GM, and I was playing my character, and his character was an NPC. And that actually started as kind of a Twilight 2000s game. We had the box, and then we also do we have New York City, or because I'm from New York, I kind of brought that in, and then we were also mixing it with Marvel superheroes. And then it ended up having this. It definitely got up to where we were doing like cross-dimensional stuff. I had a battle cat from modeled on my cat at the time from basically from He-Man, and there were kind of multi-dimensions, and I had some kind of vampiric powers too. Gosh, I wish I still had some of that stuff just to look up. It's all gone, unfortunately. But we definitely made domain play, and then I've mentioned in the past I played in a long-running sci-fi game, which was from the beginning, or at least when I joined, you were started domain, and then adventuring was basically same time. So you would create an empire, and you'd be plunked somewhere on the sort of galactic map, and then you also create player characters who were members of your empire. Usually, I think always were basically part of your military. And then so you would have things you would do as part of kind of a UN of sorts. At first, it was a UN, it was just a party, and it was just kind of understood. Like you'd kind of like, I don't know, it was almost like you'd be summoned by a greater power to come do stuff. And you kind of understood that, okay, all of us who are in this area sort of need to band together to do this thing. And then after a while, I actually created more or less a UN. Actually, I modeled it more on Dune, so I called it the Landsraad for we had like a council. I don't think I called it like the Security Council, but there was a High Council, and then there was the Landsraad, which is where basically the hegemony for the player character controlled empires was in that one council, and then all the smaller kind of non-player empires who were either on their own or they weren't important. Nobody took them over. Right? They were just kind of there. We sort of like, okay, we want to give you a voice, but you're not really going to alter anything that we as the party are going to decide. Would go down there. And there was a funny bit when one guy, he I don't know if his empire got destroyed or what happened with the empire. They started over and he probably wasn't that nice. But we put him down. We put him down the Landsrat, and I think he didn't. I don't think he appreciated that too much, which I can understand. But at the same time, like we were starting to have goals and things, and we didn't want somebody mucking it up. But it was fun. But I haven't actually run it or played in a D&D style domain game, I guess is what I'm trying to say. All right, let's see, we're at a kind of a good stopping point, but I don't want to just stop short just because. How much is this one? All right, we'll read. It's not too bad. We'll read Patty Management. In the wargaming way, we do not focus on creating an immersive fantasy persona that the player enjoys inhabiting. That's a different kind of role-playing game altogether. In this game, player characters are unique circumstances of play, tool sets you use to overcome various scenarios, and lessons in what works and what doesn't. Character management logic is necessarily fairly different from most games. The character stable. When we're figuring out what to play next in the campaign, often there are some reasons for you not to want to bring your main guy into the next scenario. So you just create a new character and play that instead. Over time, this process comes out to a stable, a store of characters that the player has created over time. And so, like in that sci-fi game, I had a stable, and I went through that same kind of logic. Though there's another piece of it, is that we were playing, in our games, some of the stuff we would get would be kind of locked to our characters. Like you drink from the magic well, and so you got that character gains one strength, right? You can't, like if you get a magic sword, we're not talking attunement or anything at this point, so you could just hand the sword off to the next guy and say, well, you go do that. Right? But ideally, you want to kind of equip them all. So at some point, maybe you have someone who's really well equipped, but they're the only one who's really well equipped. So then you want to have backup, like they've been saying. You want to have a backup. You want to have whatever. So now it's like, okay, I'm going to take a chance, not bring my main guy out because I want to build up a secondary guy. And for example, over the 10 or 15 years that I played that sci-fi game, my main guy kind of shifted because I had one guy who kind of jumped up like, ooh, he's my main guy. But then as I started to work other guys, somebody else kind of shifted. Ooh, they're my main guy. And then I tried to bring in a third. So I ended up having maybe ultimately in my particular stable, I had 4 or 5, 6 guys. And that maybe, one guy was clearly probably the one that if I asked somebody else to play with me, like who was the one character they would associate with my time, they would have mentioned one guy. And then there was maybe 2 others that were kind of just below them, but almost co-mains. The reason to jump characters may be a whimsy of game fiction. My guy doesn't like the adventure hook. Strategic on the part of the player. This is a desperate heist. I don't want to risk it. Hard positioning thing. My guy is recuperating from injuries and thus unavailable or anything else. Character stables are a good thing because they reduce artifice in campaign maneuvering. You don't need to invent elaborate stories about why these same characters keep adventuring together, even when you'd expect them not to. Stables also make character losses more survivable because the player has fallback positions. In scenario formation, players have a subjective right to play, which means that the referee doesn't go out of their way to justify why the player can't feel their character and join the fun. But the conceit of character stabling is there to form the ultimate fallback when negotiations stall. If it's difficult for some reason to convince your character to go on an adventure, make a new one who will. It is that easy. And that's something that's definitely been lost over time. As they say, players get attached to particular characters. The whole process of creating a character takes more and more time and investment, and not just the fact that there's just more procedure to it, but then a lot of GMs want more out of character generation, and that in terms of backstory and all this stuff, and that is going to just by its nature attach someone more to a particular character. So they're going to want to adventure with that character. Part of the appeal of just going 3d6 down the line, kind of fast and loose, don't worry about it, give them a name, throw them out there, is so that they feel more, going back to that kind of wargaming aspect, as a unit on the field that's more or less interchangeable with some other unit on the field. And then, of course, over time, they'll differentiate themselves, those that survive, but then, they've kind of earned more of it. But hopefully your attachment's different than it is if you only had one person. But all that to be said, like my characters, my game, they have played one character. In Daniel's game, I play one character. We don't have stables, so even though I think in many ways my game is similar to kind of this style, there are ways which are different. Like we just don't have stables, and part of that was on my players, because my players were coming from fifth edition background, and they kind of really wanted to have that more of that investment. And I wasn't going to just tell them, no, you will not have that investment. I just made sure they knew that these guys could die at the at any fall of the dice. So invest in them at your peril. But I didn't necessarily force them, but I just made very clear we can give them a little bit of a story. We can deal with this or that, but just know they're going to die. But I will say, to their credit, they took that to heart. So even though they were invested in their characters, they really played in that kind of sense. And this is the one thing that I think people talk about funnels, and sometimes the downside of using a funnel in the DCC sense is that people just throw that as not a problem at all, but some people do. They were very much not doing that, even though they knew that ultimately their characters was very disposable, and that it was, it's not hard. It wasn't hard to roll them up or anything, or lengthy, but they really kind of tried to take as much care as they could. Ian says there's another sucker born every minute. Some OSR game master, probably. I wouldn't even say probably. Absolutely. Okay, start at first level. New characters start at first level. This is important because it makes accomplished characters valuable and exceptional, and encourages natural variety in party composition. Modern D&D generally advises replacing dead characters with new characters of the same level. That utterly ruins the great accomplishment of even reaching the second level. Don't do that. And I've noticed a lot of OSR games are doing that too. And look, I do what works for you ultimately, but I'm not sure why. I think, at least in kind of what I've gleaned online, that starting at first level has kind of gone to the wayside a bit. I don't know, but it has. Anyway, let's see. When new characters start at first level, the campaign does not need to be conceived as a constant progression towards higher levels of power. Rather, the campaign consists of runs of advancement that inevitably ends sooner or later. A sense of scale is retained when your play naturally varies over the level range, following the vagaries of adventure or fate. Characters who retire or die and are replaced by new adventures are what keep the events real. I question the existence of resurrection magic in the game. I question it heavily, and it has not generally been part of my campaigns. To me, it seems to be nothing more than a way to transition from the wargaming way to a different game, one where player characters are "quote unquote" too big to fail. I do agree with that. I don't usually have resurrection. It's not something that's, just go to the local cleric and res them. Like, it doesn't. My games doesn't work like that. And in Daniel's game, one of my characters died, but we were hauling along their body for a while. And then I guess Daniel might have figured out that, I guess, for resurrection or whatever it is. No, it wasn't resurrection. It was something else. What was it? Reincarnation, maybe, because we ended up running into somebody who could cast reincarnation. That they didn't need the body to be reincarnated, so we just kind of ditched it. But now I took on a hireling. So granted, I didn't start at level 1 because they had an existing hireling who at the time I guess was 2 levels down from where I was. But I've kind of gotten back, and it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a big deal. And now I'm not even sure if I want to res. I think I might, if the guy will still do the reincarnation, maybe I'll roll to see what I get. And if it's good, I'll take it. If not, I probably won't. But I started down a little bit, but then you just ride that train right back up. Ian says they like to toe the line between a dangerous world and encouraging character investment. Yeah, and I think the character investment thing, right? It'll come out naturally as you start doing stuff. As your character survives, your investment as their character will kind of grow in advance. So you really don't need to do much. You could start off at the first level with nothing. Kind of just nothing but a name, and by the time if you're lucky enough to get to second level, you will have developed them somewhat, and they will have something in the world. And I think that gets overlooked or overshadowed now by this concept of backstorying everything. Dave says always start at first level, always be closing. ABC. Parties vary in level. If another player has a character at level 4, that doesn't mean that the game is failing when yours is at level 1. The game works just fine with a natural variety in this regard, and is in fact more fun because you get to strategize over a variety of circumstances. Note that the old school exponential character advancement math naturally ensures that low-level characters catch up when adventuring together with higher-level ones, provided they survive. Character stables, varying adventuring party composition, character deaths, as well as various XP losses, And the exponential progression means that the level hierarchy is not some permanent playgroup pyramid. Sometimes you're at the lower level and sometimes on the higher level than the rest of the party. I do tend to agree with that pretty much. Ian says they tend to give players some mechanical escape hatches, even in systems where you would normally die. I think most people do. And I think that's that kind of dying at zero instead of death is kind of a bit of an escape hatch. But to their point here, right, it's not just an escape hatch. It's also a way to explore certain things that thematically should be explorable, but that the game just brushed over, like somebody who's dying and could use help. And they're laying there with their hand covering a gushing wound, and you have to make the choice of, do we try to take them out and stitch them up? They can't possibly go on. Maybe we can drag them out of the dungeon. Do we leave them there to die? Do we end their suffering? Like those kinds of choices are interesting, right? And if you don't have it, then you kind of lose that. So it's part escape hatch, but it can also be part extending the agony. Two sides of the same coin, isn't it? It's very natural in play to have the party with a single character of higher level leading an entourage of first levelers. That's how adventure fiction often plays out, and it's a fun setup and play as well. Ian says, but even when running 5th edition, they nerfed death saves, making you take exhaustion levels every time you hit 0. Yeah, I think that, I don't even know. Is that even nerfing? I don't know. Nerfing is making them less useful, because taking on exhaustion can get pretty bad after a while. So it probably works out about the same. I always liked exhaustion. I always thought exhaustion was something that was underutilized for different things in 5th edition. Myself. But that's just me. Okay, party roles. One of the unusual characteristics of D&D is that it defaults to a cooperative team exercise. Most games tend to have individual turns where everything else grinds to a halt while each player deliberates their own actions. In D&D, most of the time, the entire party maneuvers and the players do not have turns. What this implies for party management is that the players form a natural participation hierarchy where the more skilled and motivated players do most of the playing, while the shy and passive players are more along for the ride, contributing less to the decision-making. Some players find this frustrating because their turn never comes. They have difficulty realizing that the turn was inside them all along. The turn is you. For most, though, my experience is that the natural activity hierarchy is a strength of the game. It allows newcomers to ease into the game with low-stakes participation, and nobody needs to sit the game out because of their skill level. If you don't feel like putting in too much effort today, you can just lean back and let the others play, while still nevertheless being fully present and available if something particularly challenging comes up. At the high end, the players can put as much effort and skill into it as they can without worrying about others keeping up. I think I fall kind of in between it. Right. I think that some of the natural hierarchy is good. I think it can get too extreme. And I've been someone who tends to be one of the folks who ends up pushing to the front of the pack in terms of decision making. It's happened. I try not to. I like in Daniel's game, I defer a lot. Partially that's just because I'm still catching up on the whole backstory and stuff. So I am highly, highly happy to leave the decision making to folks who have been there longer, but it's also part of a conscious decision on my part. And I've noticed that at con games too, sometimes I'll just start to kind of push into the lead when I see other folks just kind of fumbling about. Again, part of it's because I'm in a con game. I know I have 4 hours and people are kind of bonking around, not kind of making that first decision that we need to make. So I'll just be like, all right, let's go do that. But I think at the same time, I know that it's easy to say, oh, it was in you all along, but I think that's something as a GM to try to at least check on people, right? Not necessarily force engagement on everyone, but just check in on them, because that kind of, you can get alpha gamed, I think, and you need to watch out for that, because there's a fine line, as Spinal Tap might say, between the natural. What do they call it? The natural activity hierarchy, and somebody just kind of alpha gaming, and just alpha gaming meaning they're basically taking too much of an unquestioned kind of leadership role. While you can work on the team ethos and individual player skills by encouraging role swapping and trying new things, the game's nature is that everybody finds their own preferred way to participate. It'd be ideal to let that happen. Again, I think that can be true, but I think it also cannot be true. So I think that's where you as the GM, since you can at least see, you of all the players, can see the player character, the player character group somewhat from the outside. So I think just be cognizant of it. I wouldn't just rest on, natural activity hierarchy and then just not pay attention to it. But I don't disagree in theory, but I think you still got to at least pay attention to how it's developing for you. Parties can be big. While I encourage limiting each player to a single player character at a time, nothing in particular prevents the adventurers from hiring non-player character allies, hirelings, retainers, henchmen, minions, sidekicks, whatever. There's no game balance that would break from investigation of the possibilities of forming a real adventuring company capable of tackling challenging expeditions. Real people do not engage in dangerous, uncertain projects in foreign parts with a party of 3 or 4 people, and the reasons for that would apply in the simulated game world as well. This game's scoring logic naturally penalizes over-budgeting operations. Allowing players to have a real say in what they're fielding for any given scenario makes negotiated scenario balance easier to achieve, which makes for exciting gameplay. Cannot say for certain, but my current belief is that at mid-tier, the adventuring party naturally shrinks back down. The adventures become far too dangerous for non-heroic party members, which leaves only the one-player character per player again. I like to think that the way Dungeon Fantasy imagines adventuring parties as these intimate affairs of a couple of best friends and a nice elf girl is specifically depicting mid-tier heroic adventures at low-tier madness. I mean, I definitely tend to allow folks to bring in more hirelings than their charisma bonuses would allow. Charisma bonuses are still extremely powerful because I do use all the stuff for setting their initial loyalty and everything else. So I think with all the things that charisma does in terms of reaction rolls and all this stuff, I feel like allowing anybody to hire as many hirelings as they want, provided they can pay it. And like I said, all those hirelings cut into your experience returns. So if you want to bring an army into the dungeon and you can convince them all to come and you can pay them all, well, how much experience are you getting at the end of the day? Not a lot, because you're spreading out between all those hirelings, those minions who are coming in the dungeon with you. So I do think there's kind of a natural control. And my players, they really liked they kind of made an adventuring company, and they sent guys out to do different things and had some folks at home kind of watching the treasure, right? Because there's no banks. So they had, their chest, the lockbox, so to speak, and they had, I think that's kind of how this all comes up, right? Your characters go out on an adventure, your players do with their characters. And they come back, and they come back with as much as they can carry. Maybe they were smart enough to bring hirelings with them originally just to carry stuff, baggage handlers and a horse-drawing cart, and they bring back a whole bunch of loot. And I know my question was, the first time my party came back into town with all this stuff, was, okay, where are you putting it? And I know there was this look of like, what? Like, yeah, you can, now everyone's eyeballing you, and they're, everyone's clapping and lauding, oh, brilliant, you've done this thing. But of course, you can also see their eyeballs are going to your lock boxes that can clearly be seen, whether you've covered it up with a sheet or not, or whatever, in the back of the wagon. They can clearly see you're coming back. You left with an empty cart. You're coming back with a full cart. What are you gonna do with it? Well, now we got to find a place to stay, kind of a permanent place, or at least we got to pay off the inn. Okay, but if it's at the inn, that's essentially, your room is private, but it's not really locked down to you. They don't have safes and what do you call it? Safe deposit boxes in there. And even if they did, I mean, if you're looking at a modern safe deposit box, it's like a shoebox. You can't fit a whole bunch of stuff in the shoebox. Okay, well, we're gonna need someone to watch it. Okay, well, so you're gonna be gone, and who's gonna pay this guy to watch your stuff? Well, I guess we need an accountant type who's gonna watch over and also can pay our taxes and pay our rents. And okay, and who's gonna take care of that guy? All right, and who's gonna watch this? Right? You just naturally you come up with, well, now we need 3, 4, 5 guys who are not even taking with us, but have to be kind of on the payroll, hopefully are happy to work for us, who are gonna watch all the stuff while we're gone. We don't want to keep dragging out in the wilderness with us. And then, of course, you have, if you are on expedition and you are making runs into the dungeon, who's watching your campsite, who's watching the horses, who's driving the horses, who's taking care of all that stuff. And then you end up with a whole, little army retinue of folks. At least that's what I found. I don't know about you guys. That's definitely what I found. Multiple parties. With character stables, there's no reason whatsoever why the campaign would have to keep following the same party from scenario to scenario. To the contrary, it is common at mid-level for parties to break up for all kinds of reasons, often leaving individual adventurers to form new parties with new first-level allies, so that all the players end up with multiple characters hanging out with different fellow adventurers, all part of the process. The main campaign management reason to keep some throttle on this process of heroic adventures spreading out into the setting is that it forces you to choose where to focus play and which adventures to follow in detail. Players only have so much playtime to devote to the process, after all. So the thing to do is to use summary downtime processes to define positioning and find adventurers, and then move campaign attention between the variously interesting adventurers and parties as interest beckons. When some adventurer goes to do their own thing and we just never seem to get around to playing any further adventures with them for whatever reason, that's not such a problem. It's the natural consequence of us having something more interesting on our plate week to week. They're essentially retired now, as we never seem to get around to having them adventure. Yeah? Yeah. Player versus player play. A natural consequence of the extended campaign ideal of quote unquote finding adventuring opportunities based on how adventurers position themselves is that sometimes player characters end up on different sides of the same issue. One is hired by a king to run security, say, while the other is hired by a pretender to assassinate that king. Very fun situations, full of gaming potential, but also very intense for the players. The technical issue with PvP play in D&D is that in the basic game, the players learn to trust each other and work together against the merciless dungeon. Anything that throws this arrangement topsy-turvy can be deeply upsetting. It's even worse when a player decides to turn on an ally for bad reasons. Bad strategy, bad portrayal of their adventurer. Because you're not playing with perfect people, sometimes skills fall short. It is understandably frustrating to be on the receiving end of a fit like that when it's so difficult to build success, so easy to sabotage another player. The one thing you shouldn't do, either as a character player or a referee, is ambushing the other players with party betrayal. If you haven't explicitly talked about it in advance, then assume that it is not okay, and the other players are in fact assuming that the adventurers are faction by definition, quote unquote, in the same sense that a football team is supposed to play together and not betray each other. But then, on the other hand, PvP scenarios are really fun. This is how classical wargaming actually was structured. You would have two players on opposite sides, with the referee acting as a neutral third party to adjudicate the maneuvers of the two sides against each other. I always try to make this work when a campaign suggests authentic PvP situations, but you must ask before just throwing yourself into it. I absolutely won't blame anybody for just assuming that the adventurers aren't allowed to betray each other. A given campaign's table rules might allow or disallow small betrayal and big betrayal, quotes around both. It's all fine as long as you hash it out with the group. I've refereed for parties that hold court-martial with executions for traitors, entirely organic PvP, that is, and I've refereed for parties who explicitly forbid any kind of betrayal. Parties where characters steal from each other, and parties that engage in long campaign arcs of maneuver and counter-maneuver against each other. Player characters have been relinquished to be used as opposition force villains, and players have conspired with the referee to set up entire adventures for each other. They're all legit games. It's a good example of how you can set up wargaming scenarios with a different focus. I think that's going to be very table dependent, right? In that long-term sci-fi game that I played in, it was heavily PvP. And I don't mean that there was PvP every week, because there was actually, after I joined, there's very rarely any PvP. What I mean by heavy PvP was you had to be on guard at any time, the potential for PvP. But it became muted a bit because, for example, for myself, as my player characters got stronger, and I was fortunate enough for that to happen while some other players had declining fortunes. For me, after a year or two, we were playing weekly for the most part, right? So after 100 sessions, maybe 125, 50 sessions, the likelihood that they could just gank me out of the darkness and, was getting to be less and less likely. And I had set up on my standard operating procedures card, which I'll have to show off at some point because I still have it. I had set up measures for that because I was paranoid, and I think obviously so. The couple of PvP things that I was involved with, one was where I did get my empire got ambushed. Someone was betrayed me, my position, my empire's location, and I think I talked about this before. And I had to conduct a battle in my space, and I'll do a video or stream on that at some point. That was one thing, and there was another time where I had somebody under protection, and the person I had under protection had routed. Oh, hey, Map. I'm not sure if that's Matt Mike, but welcome. Glad you made it. I'm going to be wrapping things up, but feel free to if you're interested in Mustard to head back to the start of the stream, or if you'd like to subscribe, I'll take you. I'd welcome you with open arms, but otherwise you're welcome to hang out. Any case, the second time where I had to do a PvP thing came up for me personally was, and this is just kind of funny. I mentioned this, but I joined a party where everyone was essentially chaotic evil. There was one neutral guy, but he was neutral in the sense of, I'm going to just play all ends for what it was basically like he wanted to be. He was kind of chaotic evil, didn't really want to do evil stuff, but he was also didn't want to be bound to anything. And I went chaotic good. I went for the other side. So I often found myself in small conflicts, not really PvP per se, but just fundamental conflicts of procedure. Like, oh, we're going to torture everybody. We're just going to blow up the town. And I'm like, no, we're not going to blow up the town. We're not going to torture everybody. That kind of thing. In any case, at one point we had a guy came. He only played for a couple sessions, and at this point I'd become a little bit more. I had got some to put it in D&D. We weren't playing with levels, but to put in D&D parlance, I had a few levels on some of the troublemaker types. And one of the troublemaker types was doing troublemakery things while I wasn't around. And this other character came up and ratted them out, which was very kind of funny. He came up to me, he's like, hey man, I don't know if you saw, but over there on the other side of the hill, like this guy's been going around burning up the town and, pillaging and killing and everything. And I was like, oh, this, like, what is going on over there? So I go to investigate, and I thought I had protected the guy sufficiently, and all credit to the other player, they ganked him. They showed up and they shot, and I didn't have the right. This is the thing, is I never lost a PC in that game. This is here's my proud I have a couple of achievements I'm very proud of in that campaign. One of which, I never lost a PC. Okay, but PCs, my stable PCs. I had my first PC, first game one, still survived, which I'm very proud of for that. But this poor guy, so the other guy, so the evildoer, I guess saw what was happening, rolled up, and I could have kept the guy safe. I didn't think he was going to come and gank him. Well, he came up and he ganked him, and after giving him like his kudos for like, well, I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't think you'd do it, and I didn't take as many steps as I could have to protect this fellow. So I said, all right, I'm giving you a 30. I think I gave him like a 30 seconds or a 3-minute head start, because that's what it was. I'm all right, man. You know what I got to do? Like, because at that point for me, it was like, I don't want to. I mean, that was my whole point as a player. Is I don't like PvP. I don't really enjoy it, but I felt like at that moment, you've undermined my authority. You can't kill the guy who I just put under my protection. I can't just turn away from that. So I think I told him, like, you got a minute or 30 seconds or something in game terms of like, just start running. And there was some reason, because we had transporters and things. There's a sci-fi, whole mishmash of, Star Wars, Star Trek, all the different sci-fi shows. But I think on that place we couldn't transport. We couldn't use like a transporter beam kind of thing. We had to get out. So I think I gave him like, all right, you're going to have to, I'll let you go. I think I said, like, I'll give you 30 seconds as a head start. If you can get off planet before I get you, I'll let it go. We'll call even. Otherwise I'm coming. I'm pretty sure I ended up burning him down somewhere in some jungle. He was running, and I caught up to him. But I guess I go through what to say that in this game where I had PvP, it was burned into me from the start that PvP was a big thing. And the people I was playing with, for the most part, had very thick skins about their characters, and they were willing to do those things. I think for most people playing D&D in the modern time, PvP is something that I think people don't really look at, not as an ongoing concern. And so I think if you're going to have PvP, if you're going to allow PvP, if you're going to play with PvP, I think, cover all your bases, make sure everybody knows, and then kind of repeat that. Because it does stink if something like that happens to you and you have your guard down because you're not expecting your own party member at some point to just knife you in the guts. Because and who wants to play like that? Who wants to play with, like, I'm going on watch, or I'm going to sleep at camp. Do I need to roll some dice? Do I need to do something so the thief doesn't come and knife, slit my throat while I'm sleeping because they're on watch and I'm asleep? Like, it gets to be too much. Anyhow, we will take up the next one. Probably we'll come back to Muster. I don't know if we'll get a chance to hit another one this week, probably next week, but I do want to try to finish Muster by the end of the year. So we're gonna be hammering a lot more of Muster. We'll start with campaign setup next time. I will be, just to reiterate for folks who are still here, I will be at PAX Unplugged this weekend. So if you are going to be at PAX Unplugged this weekend, feel free to shout out to me. I mean, honestly, if I'm recording, if I'm talking to somebody and I'm filming it, then maybe wait till after I'm done to come say hi. But come say hi. Let me know what you're playing. Maybe I'll even get you on. I know I always think about like talking to other creators, but it'd probably be cool to just talk to some gamers, see what folks are playing. So if you find me, just come say hi. Doesn't have to be anything more than that. All that said, nice to meet you, Map Milk or Map Mike. Where's my glasses? I can't tell. Either way, nice to meet you. Hope you'll be back. For everyone else, and actually not everyone else, for everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, night, whenever you end up watching or listening to this. Game on, everybody. And I'll talk to you later. Bye now.